In this webinar, you will explore how a data management plan looks like, why it is useful and important for a project, and how researchers can be prepared to answer questions in the data management planning. Speaker of the today session is Georgia Kutantaki. Hello, Georgia. She's a young scientist from Greece. She studied chemical engineering and now she is doing her PhD in chemical and process engineering at University of Chemistry and Technology in Prague, working in the laboratory of bioengineering and advanced materials. Georgia is actively involved in both national and international initiatives that promote good scientific practices and open science. She is also a member of the Czech Data Stewards community and the founder of its STEM subcommunity. So now I would like to give the word to Georgia. Georgia, it is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I will share my screen. If you have some questions, I might not be able to see the chat, so you can write it, and after there will be a short Q&A, so we can discuss everything in the end. So good morning. As Eva said, I'm a chemical engineer finishing my PhD. I am data steward for STEM fields in the National Repository Platform, and I work at the Faculty of Information Technology in the Czech Technical University, and I'm part of the data stewardship team at UCT Prague. And I do the international coordination of the Czech data stewards community. So, welcome to today's webinar called DMP Why Me? And I like to play a little bit to make things a little funny in order to lighten them up. So this webinar is named like this because it came from these questions that you see here. There were a lot of people who had issues to understand what DMPs are. DMPs is the data management plan. I hope you know the abbreviation. They couldn't understand why it's important to make DMPs at this point and why is it suddenly a huge deal. They don't understand how they can be helped through a DMP, but also after understanding these basic things, there are the questions about how to fill in a DMP and what to do. I don't have all the information. How can I be compliant and how can I use the DMP and not basically waste my time? So I like to always start with a short vocabulary of open science, and on the bottom I have also a link for you for later from Open Science CZ, where you can see the words in Czech and English, so the terminology is in both languages. But if you see today OS or DS, it means Open Science and Data Steward. DMP is the main topic, so please remember this is data management plan. And then we have metadata. Metadata are what I like to call data about the data. So information about the data, anything reminding us how the data were analyzed, what was the workflow, where did they start, where did they finish, is metadata. And then we have the FAIR principles. The FAIR principles for data management or guiding principles for data management and stewardship are called FAIR. If you have not heard it before, the abbreviation means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I will be expanding a little bit on it. If you see CC or Creative Commons, we're talking about open licenses that are used today for data and publication. CC is the abbreviation for Creative Commons. There are other open licenses, just this is very commonly seen, and in my presentation there are some mentions of it. CC does not mean a specific license, so it doesn't mean CC BY or doesn't mean something else. It means just all the collection of these licenses. So we're talking about the general collection. And last but not least, we have the persistent identifier, PID. So if you see PID, it means some identity, unique digital identity to some object, person, or something like that. For example, my actual ID is not digital, but if it was digital, it could be persistent identifier. But I have ORCID or ORCID, and this is a persistent identifier, so you can always find it and connect it to the metadata, which says it's me and what I have done. And the DOI is a very common persistent identifier that you see probably all the time. So let's talk a little bit about the FAIR principles initially. We have findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. For these 4 terms, they are much more explained, of course, in their paper that they were first published and in a lot of other papers that you can find them. But for you, the basic idea is the following. So when we talk about data being fair, you will hear about it a lot. We mean that there are these guiding principles that help us make the data as easy to use as possible, let's say, and not to basically waste the resources that are used in research. So with findability, we mean that the data need to be easy to find, not just by humans, but also by machines. So if I do a search online, I am able to find the data set. Accessibility means that once I have found the data set, I need to know how can I access it. It might be through some restricted access, so I might not actually be able to see the data, but I still know that there is some specific way to access it. And in the accessibility mode, we are also asking if there is some authentication and authorization protocol, so that it's not simply placed in a website. Then interoperability is usually where a lot of people find it uncomfortable. It's mostly because of the name, but it's quite simple in the end. Interoperable, so the operation need to be able to work together. So I have some data, and for example, I want to use it in another application or in another system, and then the data shouldn't lose their meaning and they should be able to be used this way. The data formats are helping there because, for example, if I have an open data format and not the proprietary format, I can open it in several systems and the data will not be broken inside the file. But also metadata standards play a role here because we are using the same language, let's say, to understand the same things, not just as humans, but also the machines understand the same things with us. And last but not least, we have reusability, which is probably the most understandable term. How can I reuse the data? And here come the licenses. So we need clear terms of use, even if it's copyrighted. But for example, if there are not clear terms of use, we have as a rule of thumb to consider the data copyrighted or any other work copyrighted. So you basically don't mess with that. And it's a shame if your data are not copyrighted and you forget the license, because then people cannot reuse it. So I will move forward. And the question here is, are FAIR data always open? And sometimes people see FAIR as like a scary thing, let's say, because it sounds like you're obligated to fulfill everything 100%. FAIR is kind of measured with metrics. You could fulfill everything 100%, of course, but it is really guiding principles, not obligations. So the more you can fulfill, the better, but it doesn't mean that you are doing something wrong if some parts of your data cannot be fulfilling FAIR. And for example, FAIR does not push you to make all your data open, because you could have data that is restricted for specific reasons. It could be personal data that you cannot share with everyone, or it could be some part of intellectual property data. So this is acceptable through FAIR. Now, the question is, why do we even care to preserve our data? All right, there is this long-term preservation, use long-term preservation formats, keep your data available. We want to see them 5 years after your project, blah, blah, blah. The point is that we are trying to reuse research as much as possible. So when you are doing something, it actually has a meaning for the future and not just for the moment you're doing it. And by creating data that is able to be archived and used in long-term ways, you basically help people to interpret your data correctly, but also yourself. You can open your data much later, even if it is, for example, some data that you have not used in 5 years. You could suddenly have a new paper, you read a new paper and you're like, okay, I had this data, I want to create a new project based on that. By making the data ready for long-term preservation, you actually have a chance to do that. Now, what is DMP, which is today's topic? Data management plan basically is an organization system. It's a way that you organize how data management is working for your project, or even in your lab. Some people like to do it regardless of a project. So the data management plan usually contains all information about who is part of the data management, creators, analyzers, supervisors, data management plan creators, like a data steward, but also it focuses a lot on reuse terms, on what datasets are existing, what datasets are published and what are not, if quality processes were followed during the data creation and analysis, as well as if related software is needed to use this data or to understand this data. And here I would like to starting in a little bit more positive about data management plans. A lot of times they are considered time-consuming obligations, so basically a waste of time. And a lot of times it ends up being, let's say, an obligation that the person who is not really working with the data in a project ends up filling up. And sometimes it becomes like something you don't really want to understand. So it's just a random questionnaire. I have to fill it up to be okay with the funder. It's not really a good way to think about it, because this way you are losing from the quality of a data management plan and you don't take advantage of what it can offer you. So forget about the funder for a while. Think about yourself, how the data management plan can help you. And the way that it can help you is that, as I said before, is your organization system. Anyone in your team can read this document and find where are the data, how are they named, who made the data. It is easy to get ideas through the data management plan, because you see all the data and you can create new connections in your brain. If you're a researcher, you know there is a lot of creativity in thinking of new projects. It's much easier to see the list of data and think how they can be connected than having a group that has data in separate computers that you don't know where they are. But also it's a way of not losing time, of avoid losing time, because you basically don't need to search where these data are or what they mean or how they were created, or even if some researcher leaves your team, you don't have to chase them to find out the data, or they are not just taking them with them. You know where the data are, and then you are gaining time and resources, basically. Now, we're going to dive a little deeper. What do we expect to actually see in the data management plan? So before, in Czech Republic, most of the times we have 3 data management plans, somewhere before the submission or during the submission. Then we have during the first interim report or somewhere in the middle of the project. And then we have one in the end of the project. So I will use this 3-case scenario. It's possible that you have less obligations, so you don't need to create a data management plan for all these scenarios. But if you're doing it to help yourself, it actually is better to follow this 3-step scenario at least, because you actually keep your data information updated, and you, by the end of a project, you don't actually forget some data existed. So before the project, we are expecting to see what you think the data will be. What is the expected size? Do you have enough space to work with this data? Do you need to buy software or hardware, or do you need to rent a server? And how do you plan to deal with the ethics of the project? Are you going to have questionnaires, for example, and have you gotten an ethics approval? Also, we care about what policies are you following, and if you have already specified who is the data owner, because the data owner will tell you who can publish the data and how can the data be published. There are also some questions about naming conventions or how you plan to keep your data after the project. The naming conventions can be just an idea. For example, we plan to use this convention system, which you can, of course, later change because it didn't work out. But there is also a way to explain how you will make your data fair. And this is where you talk about your metadata, your persistent identifiers, like I am changing all my data formats in the end of the project to long-term preservation formats and not proprietary, or I am using a specific metadata schema which makes the data more available to the public. Then in the middle of the project, or as I said in the first interim report, you are expected to give some more information. You probably have already created your first data or even published them. So we need a more specific list of what the data are. Are they equipment created data, or are they interviews or some other type of non-equipment data? And since you created data, you have to start thinking about which repositories are you going to use and why. And very importantly, you need to think about your persistent identifiers. Like if you will manage to give your datasets DOI, for example, or another persistent identifier like a handle, because this gives, let's say, the green light to the funder usually that you actually are having the data somewhere, or at least you're planning to have the data somewhere, and they can click on this link and they can go and actually see that what you're saying is true. And very importantly, when the data are started being created, since on the first part you have to think about the ownership of the data, then you have to also start thinking what are the licenses you need for the data. And we expect to see either specific licenses that were agreed upon in the beginning with the funder. But, for example, sometimes the funder might be asking for a specific license, but you have a clear reason why you cannot use it. For example, I cannot anonymize the data, they will lose the meaning. So I cannot open my data, and I need to keep them as closed as possible. This is an understandable term. So if you mention this in the beginning of your project, in your project proposal and in your first data management plan, it should be something understandable. Now, the final DMP usually is the biggest one, and you need to give a lot of information about all the datasets. So you need to explain what the datasets are, what are the names, what are their PIDs and licenses, where do they exist? Do they exist in a repository online? Do they exist simply in your university? But you need to explain where they are, and you also need to explain why some data were not published. So you need to actively explain that these data were created, they are used for some publication, for example, but they are not published for this and this reason. Also, in the final DMP, you get an overview of your previous DMPs and you explain the changes. So if you promise that you will publish everything open science and everything will be CC BY, but you ended up not doing that, you need to give proper reason why. And you also are expected to show that you are using data formats for long-term archiving, or if not, why. And there is possibility that you created a specific data format for a software that you are using or that you are creating yourself. That is acceptable, just you need to be able to explain this information. And of course, you need to be proving the fairness of the data. But if you explain all this, if you give the licenses, the persistent identifiers, the metadata, the naming conventions, the data format, all this in a package basically show that your data are fair. So these are intertwined. Now, we will go through an extensive, let's say, data management plan in a template form. There are a lot of ways to fill in a data management plan. It can be simply writing paragraphs in a text document. It can be in an application online. We're going first for template, simple question and answer format. And afterwards, we will see the data stewards wizard from DMP EXZ, how it works and how it can make sometimes your life easier. So this data management plan questions are part of a Docker Enhanced Data Stewardship course that were created by the Arctic University of Norway. I have cut it down, so we don't have that much time to discuss about it, but we will go through it a little bit step by step. So initially, you get your questions about the contributors. So who is going to create this data management plan and who can we contact if we have questions about the data management plan? Are you having external collaborators? Are you working with another university or with a company for this project? And there you see 3 questions: who has the right to manage, who has the right to access, and who has the ownership? And these 3 questions are not the same because this could differ based on what type of data you have. First of all, you need to know who owns the data. Who owns the data will clarify who can choose the licenses and who can publish the data. The right to manage and the right to access could be different. For example, in a project, it could be possible that all project members have the right to access the data, but they don't have the right to manage the data. So there you need to clarify if there is a sub-team that can use it or not. And this is usually more important in more sensitive types of data, but it's still important to remember that these 3 things are not necessarily the same. Now, about collecting and generating data, you'll get a lot of questions, as in what types of data? Are they, I don't know, experimental data? Are they questionnaires, interviews, or are you doing simulations? Or how did this data end up existing? So are they coming from other data that already existed, or are you creating them by scratch? And also, what are your quality processes? What standards are you following? Are you, for example, doing calibrations, or you are simply taking whatever data you find, which is not the case, of course, but this is the point of the question. And of course, if you need external software and hardware, can be mentioned in the data management plan. And this is for 2 reasons. One reason is that you basically explain that the data cannot be opened without this specific software because the data is this and this and that. But another reason why this question is important is for you, because if you mention in your project that you need money for a specific software, and then in your data management plan you explain exactly that this data is expected to be created with this software, it gives you an extra, let's say, it gives some extra information to the funder of why they should give you this money. And why did you ask for this money? So it makes sense that you are getting it. Then you go to documentation and metadata, and there you are expected to know Of course, not from the beginning, all these questions can be answered, but you're expected to at least think, what metadata are you going to use? Are you going to use some metadata standard that is commonly used from other researchers in your field? You could look online, for example, in fairsharing.org and see what metadata standards exist, for example, for spectroscopy or for biology, because there could be some metadata standard that tells you you need to just answer these questions in your metadata, and then other people from the same field can understand what your metadata are. But also, as I said before, in the documentation of metadata, file formats, naming conventions, and even folder structure is important. And here you see that in the best practices also exists the README file. The README file is an extra file we add with our data, usually, that has much more explanation for the metadata that cannot be filled, for example, in the metadata section of the repository, because there are not enough specific sections for it. So a README file would look a little bit something like that. In the first page, let's say, it could have the author's names and ORCIDs, who is the contact person, sort, abstract, and license. But then the important part of the README file is information you usually cannot put in the repository. So what is the file naming conventions? Where do the data come from? Are there related works? Did you do a publication, and what is the DOI of this publication that consists this data? And the most important part is the naming. For me, there are, of course, a lot of other things you can put in the README file. Ethics, licenses, changes that are done in the data are important. But this part, the explaining of the names you're using for your dataset, not just on the dataset name, but also inside the data file, is very important, because it helps the reader understand what you're writing. So if I have short abbreviations that I understand only myself, it's very difficult for someone who is not in the same laboratory, for example, to immediately understand what you mean. So here, for example, we are mentioning the abbreviations and what do they mean. Then we're giving an example of the naming convention in its generic form. So it's YYY, which means year of collection, method, data type, and version. It's a very simple naming convention. And below, we are giving an actual example, so they know how it looks like inside the data. So this is how the naming conventions explain in the README file. And if you're working with code, you could have some extra information, for example, about licenses. Sometimes people are using the same, let's say, for example, this is from GitHub, that we have published something, and we don't have only software, but we also have some other outputs. Outputs that are not software, and software usually have a different license. So here you can see we have two license tabs. So in the README file, we're explaining that some part of what you see is in one license and another is with another license. The script here has MIT license, while another output has Creative Commons license. And also we add suggested citations. So you can explain that for the specific output, you can cite it like this, licensed under CC BY, but for the script, there is a completely different license and a different citation. And you can always use suggested citations so people know how to cite you, and you get your citations as you need them. To continue with the data management plan, we have questions about storage and preservation. So questions about who is doing the backup of the data, where is the backup of the data done, where are the data stored during the project, and what is the file sizes, is what you expect it to be, did it change during the project. This question of the file size is good to be updated every time you're updating your data management plan, so you have an actual presentation of what the size of the data are. If you're using a server, for example, and the project ends, what are you going to do with the data? Also, if you need extra services for storage, for example, if you're using an external repository or if you are going to a biobank, for example. Now, the archiving and sharing is quite extensive, and it not only asks how you're doing the archiving and sharing, but also for which data are you doing it. So you don't necessarily need to have all your data preserved, because you might have created some data that are not useful, that were not good data in the sense of there was some problem in the project, some equipment didn't work right, we have to delete this data. But usually you are asked to explain why some data were destroyed, for example, and which data you're actually preserving. Other questions will arise about security and ethical considerations and which data will not be shared and what reason. Is the same thing that I was explaining before. We expect to know why you're not sharing some specific data. And also, another question arises about if you need to process your data before publishing them or preserving them. For example, you need to anonymize the data, but also if you need to change the format. So if you have a different raw format of the data than the one that you are preserving, or if you are preserving both. And in archiving and sharing, you need to be able to explain where the data will be archived, so which repository, which storage, what the exact license is. So you see the final DMP will have all these questions answered. But of course, if you don't know all these answers in the beginning, it gives you at least the opportunity to think about your possibilities. So when the data will be made available, will you keep them for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years? For example, it could depend on your repository, it could depend on your resources. If you're paying for a repository, you might be able to preserve them for longer. And then the last section is always about ethics, and you should not forget this section, especially if you're working with sensitive data. If you're working, for example, with informed consent for questionnaires that the people know what they are answering and why, how are you going to use the data, and how are you going to protect the identity of people involved in your studies. Now, we're going to have a 5-minute break, and then we're going to use the data stewardship wizard together in the application. Okay, so just 5-minute break. Be back by 33, by 40. Yeah, thank you. If it's okay, I will continue, and I will share again my screen. Wanted to say before we continue that data management plans sometimes are complicated, especially when you're working with different funders. You might expect that they will all accept the same thing. So if you get feedback from your funders that something was not accepted or something is not the way they expect it to be, make sure you inform your data stewards or data stewards from your university, for example, because this helps us as data stewards community to give better information to you and to also revise what we are saying, get feedback. So please, if you get some feedback, do inform us. We like to have as updated information as possible. Now, we have the, we have the using a designated application for your data management plans. And as you might have heard, the National Repository Platform has created an instance for EOSC-CZ for DMP for the purposes of the Czech research infrastructures. And you can use it if you have logged in through eInfra-CZ. Most of the institutions should have this login. And basically, it is a designated application where you have question and answer mode. But in a lot of cases, you don't have to actively write a paragraph to answer like before in the template, but you actually could choose from multiple choice questions, or some questions do not appear to you if your previous questions don't make them necessary. So for the Czech RDM infrastructure, and that means for the Czech institutes, not just for Czech researchers, but for researchers in the Czech Republic, this dmp.iosk.cz is available, and it's in pilot mode, but you can use it and give feedback for it because it is made for you. So if you give feedback, you will get better services. This is the intro page. You can click Start Planning, and here is how it looks like in the introduction. You can create projects, and inside the projects you see something like this, like a question and answer. I will go through it in a minute. You will see it better. But here I want to show that one of the best parts of the data stewardship wizard is that you can actually collaborate with your coworkers. So if there is a registered user, you can add them to your project and you can answer live at the same questions. You can discuss in the comments if you agree or disagree with something, and they can have different rights to the project. They could be simply a viewer, so they could do a check, or they could be an editor, so they could do much more for you, for your project. Another very useful, I would say, part is that we have the nested questions. So as I said before, sometimes questions pop up only when your previous answers make sense to make them pop up. So here in the second question on the left, there are two answers. There is no and yes. And next to no answer, you will see 3 lines, 3 dots with 3 lines. This means that there is a nested question below. So a pop-up question will come after you answer no. You see here, I answer yes on the left side, so I go immediately to the next question. But when I answer no on the right side, I get the exact question that is a follow-up from the previous question. So you don't have to answer the follow-ups if your questions did not make sense in that sense. So this way it saves you time. And you can automatically have the versioning available for your DMP. The changes made in the DMP and the publication date and the versions are some expectation in your data management plan. Usually the second page of your data management plan, it should mention this is the DMP, it was made then, this is the version we're looking at now, these are the changes we made. And here in the data stewardship wizard on the left side, you can click on version history and name the specific version. And if, for example, then we are exporting the document, and on the right side, you can see how it looks in the document. And you can see history of changes. The date here is the same because I did it for an example. So if you are using it, if you're naming the version in another date, it will show the correct date there. But for example, here you have version 1, initial version DMP, version 1.3, added metadata description. So you name it in the data stewardship wizard and you get the table immediately in your document. And now I will go in the wizard. I will click on the link. In the data stewardship wizard, I clicked on the first link that takes us to the dataset. And in the dataset is just one example. You see there are a lot of different questions, sections that you can answer to. But the dataset here, we will do an example. You click add and you can add several datasets. So I can add the second one and more. And for example, I named my dataset potato. And here in the identifier of the dataset, if I don't click add, I don't need to answer this. But when I click add, I have to put a DOI, potato.com, and a dataset identifier type. I put DOI, and from the first sharing, I get actually a list where I can choose. So when the funder is checking my DMP, they can simply click on this link in the DMP and actually see the identifier if they need to check it. So here you can add dataset type. So this was a questionnaire, for example, and description, or will this dataset be published? When I answer no, it pops up the question, why not? Or what is the purpose of collecting this data? For example, here, the purpose of collecting the data can be chosen from a list that you have answered before. And the list you have answered before is in the project proposal, so it's in the beginning. Here it's just random letters because I was doing this example. But this is how it looks like. And when I go to the documents and create a document, or it's the same if I do the preview for now, so you can just see this information. It will take a minute and it will show us how my answers look like in the data management plan. So here you see the first page has, for example, here I have chosen Horizon Europe data management plan. It has a logo for the funder. And here I have not versioned my DMP, so the versions are empty. There are the contributors. I have not mentioned if I am a data manager or whatever, so it's simply my name and my email. And then when I go to the dataset summary, we answered that the generated datasets are potato, there is the DOI, the purpose of the dataset is not specified, and the collection process is not defined for this dataset. And this is because we have added the add part. Now I will go to delete that. So if I delete here the identifier, for example, and I clear these questions and I delete this answer, and I go again to preview. Now, in the dataset, you see that the information about the DOI is completely deleted. So if you delete it, it will not say there is no DOI given. Only if you click on the DOI and then you leave it empty, it will say that it was not given. Now, on the Data Stewardship Wizard, there is a very useful part for you. If you are clicking on the comments here, so for example, for this dataset, I have a question. Will the potatoes be fried, for example? And I can comment here. So now I'm leaving this part and I'm going to another section. And when I click on the comments part, I can just click on the comment and it will take me to the exact question that I made that comment. And I can also, as I showed, share my project. For example, here I have shared it with Mary Jane. She's a commenter. And here in my comment, I can simply assign the comment to Mary Jane. She gets an email, or if she goes to her dashboard, she should see that she has a comment that she needs to answer. And if I click on the data preservation link, we go to the data preservation strategy, for example. And here we can label this data preservation strategy. So for example, potatoes in the field. And then it asks you, are you going to use the same preservation strategy for different data sets, or are all data sets using the same preservation strategy? For example, are all your potatoes staying in the field, or are you separating them, some in the field and some in the box? So if I click no, it will ask me which data sets follow this strategy. And you can select from the data we mentioned before that the potatoes are following this preservation strategy. And again, on the preview, you can see that. Yeah, here, if we had mentioned more things in the preservation strategy, it would show more information. Here I didn't add it, so I shouldn't have showed it, but it doesn't matter. But you will see the changes that you do automatically in the preview if you have chosen a document template, or you can simply create a new document and download it and see the changes there. You can also see fair metrics, or if you have answered, for example, enough questions on the data access and reuse restrictions, and you will get a graph here, we'll show it more. And also about the version, I will show it here. You click on the version history. We are on the current version, and I named this version Potato 1. Potatoes are fried. And after that, I go to the preview, and it should show already the version and history. Yeah, so you see on the second page, you immediately get the history of changes that it happened today, what are the changes, and what is the version. And I hope you find it useful. You could try it yourself. You don't have to be answering all the questions all the time. Here, for example, when I created the project, I chose to see the tag of Horizon Europe DMP, so I know that these questions are expected to be answered in the Horizon Europe DMP, so I don't have to answer all the other questions that might not have this, this tag here. So I think, just a moment here. Yeah, so this is the whole presentation for today. And I hope you found it useful. And now we have some time for questions, actually.
So, Georgia, thank you very much.